Hey guys, tonight we're going to a medieval wedding where the ceremony did not happen inside the church at all. It happened outside it, at the door, in the porch, in the open air, in front of whoever in the parish felt like standing about and watching. And once you know that one small thing, the rest of the day begins to arrange itself into a shape that makes a strange kind of sense. If you enjoy these long, slow histories and you'd like more of them, a like and a subscribe helps this little channel more than you would think. Only if you're genuinely enjoying it, of course. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me which part of the world you're listening from and what the clock says where you are. There is something quietly lovely about seeing all those different hours gathered in one place. So, let's begin somewhere ordinary. A village in late spring, somewhere in England or northern France, in the middle of the 14th century. The morning is bright and still a little cold in the shadows, the way spring mornings are before the sun gets properly organized. The hawthorn along the lane has come into blossom, which the older women in the village will tell you means the season has turned for good. There is cow parsley up to the knee at the edge of the churchyard, and the sheep that usually keep the grass down among the graves have been shooed out for the morning and are complaining about it from behind the wall. The church itself is not enormous. It is a squat stone building with a low tower and a roof that needs attention, and it is still the largest thing any of these people have ever stood inside. Attached to the south side, over the main door, there is a porch. A small stone room, open at one end, with a bench built into either side wall, and a floor worn into shallow dips by generations of feet. It smells of cold stone and dust, and, faintly, of the incense that drifts out when the door is open. And this is where the wedding is going to happen. Not at an altar, not down an aisle. Here, in this little half-outdoor room, standing on the flagstones with the light coming in sideways and the whole parish crowded in behind. The porch was not chosen for atmosphere. It was chosen because it was, in a very practical sense, the legal room of the village. The porch was where business got done, where oaths were sworn, where money owed under a will could be handed over in front of witnesses, where the first part of a baptism took place before the child was carried inside. It was the threshold between the sacred space and the ordinary world, and a great many things that needed to be both holy and public happened exactly there. A marriage was one of those things. And the fact that it happened in the doorway, in the daylight, with everyone able to see and hear, tells you almost everything about what a medieval marriage actually was. It was a public contract long before it was a private romance. The point of standing in the porch was that the neighbours could watch you do it and could be called upon, years later, to say that they had. Now, before we go any further, let me take away a few of the things we tend to picture, because the real day is much better without them. There is no white dress. White as the colour of a wedding gown is a fashion of the 19th century, and it caught on properly only after Queen Victoria married in white in 1840. Our bride is wearing her best clothes, whatever her best clothes happen to be, and if the family can afford dye, she is very likely wearing colour. A good strong red, a blue, a green, because bright colour was expensive, and this is the day you show what you have. If she is young and unmarried, she may well have her hair loose or lightly dressed, with a garland of flowers or a circlet of leaves on her head, made that morning by her friends out of whatever the hedgerows were offering. There are no bridesmaids in matching gowns walking in formation. There is no long walk down an aisle while an organ plays, because there is no aisle procession as we mean it, and in a small parish church very probably no organ either. There is no best man holding the rings in a little box, no photographer arranging everybody by height, no seating plan with cards on it, and absolutely nobody has been asked whether they prefer the chicken or the fish. Nearly every single detail that a modern person imagines when they hear the word wedding is Victorian or later. Invented or heavily reorganized in the last 200 years or so, the medieval version is simpler, louder, more crowded, considerably more legal, and in some ways much stranger than anything we do now. Which brings us to the thing underneath all of it. What was marriage actually for? The honest answer is that it was for joining two households. Not two hearts in the first instance. Two households. A marriage moved land, or the use of land. It moved goods, animals, tools, bedding, cooking pots, and sometimes a payment in coin. It moved labour, because a household in the Middle Ages was not simply a family. It was a small economic unit that had to feed itself, and it needed a certain number of working hands to get through the year. It created an alliance between two sets of relatives who would now be obliged to help one another in 100 practical, unglamorous ways. At harvest, in court, in a bad winter, in a quarrel with a neighbour. Preachers and moralists wrote at length about the love and the kindness that ought to exist between a husband and a wife, and we will come back at the very end of tonight to the real evidence that a great many medieval couples were fond of one another in ways that would be entirely recognizable. And it produced legitimate children, which mattered enormously, because legitimacy decided who inherited what, and inheritance decided whether a family stayed on its land or drifted quietly away into poverty. Affection was welcome. Affection was hoped for. Today. But affection was not the purpose of the institution. Nobody thought the point of a marriage was that two people were in love. The point of a marriage was that two households had decided to become connected, and the couple standing in the porch were the joint where that connection was made. That said, this looked extremely different depending on where in society you were standing, and it is worth walking gently through the three broad levels, because they are almost three different customs wearing the same name. At the bottom, and by far the largest group, are the people who worked the land. For them, a marriage was, above all, a practical joining of two working households. What mattered was whether the pair could actually run a holding, whether there was a cottage or a share of one, whether there was land coming to them, whether the young man had learned his craft, and whether the young woman knew how to brew and bake and spin and keep poultry and manage a dairy and manage money, because in a peasant household none of those were hobbies. They were half the income. Marriages were discussed by families and neighbours in a slow, sideways, gossiping sort of way over months. And if the family were unfree tenants of a manor, they needed something else as well. The Lord's permission. In England there was a payment for this, called merché, a fee owed to the Lord when a villein's daughter married, and it turns up again and again in manor court records, a few pence or a few shillings written down in a clerk's cramped hand. The Lord's interest was not sentimental. A daughter marrying away might take labour and value off his manor, and he wanted compensating. Somewhere in England, on the morning of a wedding, a father was still quietly grumbling about that fee. In the towns, marriage looked more like a business alliance, because towns ran on trade and on the guilds that governed the trades. A young man who had served out his apprenticeship needed capital and connections to set up on his own, and marrying the daughter of an established master, or the widow of one, could supply both at a stroke. Widows in particular were often formidably well placed. In many towns a widow could carry on her late husband's workshop, and she brought with her tools, stock, premises, trained servants and standing. Urban dowries were more likely to be reckoned in cash and goods than in fields. Coin, cloth, plate, furniture, and a bed with its hangings, which was frequently the single most valuable object in the house. The negotiations could be minutely detailed, written down, and enforced. We will come back to the contracts later tonight because they are quietly fascinating. And then, at the top, there is the nobility, where marriage is essentially politics conducted by other means. Here the stakes are castles, manors, titles, wardships, claims, and the loyalty of whole regions. A marriage could end a feud, seal a treaty, add a county to a family's holdings, or plant a claim on a line of inheritance that might matter 100 years later. These matches were arranged by parents, guardians, lawyers, and sometimes kings, with the two people at the centre being informed of it rather than consulted. It is at this level that you meet the betrothals of children, a boy and a girl promised to one another very young, because two families wanted the alliance fixed before circumstances could change. And it is worth saying plainly because it is often badly reported. That was an aristocratic land and alliance practice, and not how ordinary people lived. Church law set a low minimum age at which a promise could become a binding marriage, but a legal minimum is not a description of ordinary life. In northwestern Europe, most people married comparatively late, commonly in their 20s, because a couple were expected to set up a household of their own, and that took years. Years of saving, of service in someone else's house, of waiting for a holding to come free. Marriage waited on money. And even among the nobility, a betrothal made in childhood was usually just that, a contract, with the two young people kept in separate households for years afterwards, and the marriage only taking effect much later. That is the accurate picture, plainly said, and we move on. So how did an ordinary couple actually get from an understanding to a wedding morning? The first real step was the betrothal, and betrothal is the part that modern people underestimate most badly. A betrothal was a promise to marry, spoken aloud, usually in front of witnesses. A few relatives, a neighbour or two, perhaps in a kitchen, perhaps in a garden, perhaps in the doorway of an inn, which is exactly the sort of detail that turns up later in court records. There were often gifts. A ring, a brooch, a pair of gloves, a length of ribbon, a purse. Sometimes a coin was bent or broken between the two of them, each keeping half, so that the halves could be fitted back together afterwards as proof. Sometimes the couple joined hands while they said the words, which is where the old word handfasting comes from. And sometimes they sealed the promise with a kiss in front of everyone present, which was less a romantic flourish than a signature. And here is the part that surprises us. That promise was not a casual understanding you could quietly walk away from. Under the Church's law, it created a real obligation, and it could be enforced. If one party changed their mind, the other could take the matter to a church court and ask for the promise to be honoured, and people did, quite often. Whole files of medieval church court business consist of neighbours arguing about what exactly was said, in whose kitchen, and whether the words used were a promise about the future or a declaration of the present moment. Because those two things had wildly different consequences. We are going to spend a long, happy stretch of tonight inside that legal tangle later on. For now, simply hold on to this. In this world, the promise was already most of the marriage. The ceremony at the door was the public confirmation of something that had, in a sense, already begun. Once the betrothal was settled, and the families had agreed the practical terms, the church added its own step. And it is the step that has survived, in a ghostly sort of way, into every wedding scene in every film you have ever watched. The banns. From the early 13th century, and the Great Church Council of 1215 is the usual landmark here, parish priests across Western Christendom were required to announce a couple's intention to marry publicly in the parish church on 3 separate Sundays before the wedding. The priest would stand up in front of the congregation and name them. This man and this woman of this parish intend to marry, and if any of you knows of a reason why they may not lawfully do so, you are to declare it. In front of everybody who had ever known either of them. It was, in effect, a rudimentary public records system in a world with almost no records. The parish itself was the archive, and the memory of the neighbours was the database. And that announcement is the direct ancestor of the line about speaking now or forever holding your peace, which we now treat as pure drama, and which began life as a serious administrative safeguard against accidentally creating a marriage that was not valid. So what counted as a reason? What was an impediment? Broadly, 4 things. That one of them was already married to somebody else, which happened more often than you would like. That one of them had already made a binding promise to somebody else, which is that dangerous betrothal again, surfacing at the worst possible moment. That the 2 of them were too closely related, and the medieval church counted relationship very widely indeed, including relationships created by marriage, and even the spiritual kinship created by standing godparent to a child, or that one of them was underage. Any of these could stop a wedding, and any of these, discovered later, could unpick a marriage years after the fact. We will take all of that apart properly later tonight because it produced some of the most gloriously tangled legal cases of the entire Middle Ages. But not yet. For now, the banns have been read 3 times. Nobody stood up. The terms have been agreed, the animals counted, the fee paid to the Lord, the promises made and witnessed, and the bride's friends have been up since first light making a garland out of hedgerow flowers. And so, on this bright cold morning in late spring, the village is gathering. They come up the lane in 2s and 3s in their best clothes, wool brushed, hoods straightened. Children run on ahead. Somebody is carrying a jug they will refuse to explain. The sheep grumble beyond the wall. The bell rings out over the fields, sending the rooks up out of the elms in a black scatter, and the crowd presses in around the porch, shoulder to shoulder, arranging itself so that everyone can see. There is laughter, and that particular restless hush of people waiting for something to begin. Then the church door opens, and the priest comes out to meet them at the threshold. And so, after all the arranging and the waiting, after the banns have been read out on 3 separate Sundays, and nobody in the parish has stood up to say that this cannot happen, the morning finally comes. It comes early. Medieval weddings were morning affairs, and there were good reasons for that. Part of it was practical, because a whole day of eating and dancing was to follow, and the light was wanted. Part of it was religious, because the wedding was normally crowned with a mass, and those who intended to receive communion were expected to come fasting, having eaten nothing since the night before. So the bride and groom of a medieval village very often married on an empty stomach in the cool of the morning, with a great deal of bread and ale waiting for them somewhere just out of reach. It is likely, too, that the day fell in a particular part of the year, because the church kept what were called the closed seasons, stretches of the calendar when marriages were not to be solemnized. Advent through to Epiphany was closed. Lent, all the way to the week after Easter, was closed. In many places, the days around Rogation Tide and Pentecost were closed as well. Weddings therefore bunched up in the gaps, and the gaps people liked best were late spring and early summer, when the days were long and the roads were passable, and then the autumn, once the harvest was in and an ordinary household actually had food in the house. So a medieval wedding belongs in a soft and generous light. Hawthorn coming into flower along the lane, long grass. The particular greenish brightness of a northern European morning in May. The whole household is awake. There is a great deal of fussing over clothes. And then, at some point, everyone simply walks to the church, and this ought to be said first, because it explains a great deal about the rest of the day. Nobody arrived at a medieval wedding by carriage at the last moment to a hush. They walked, in a straggling crowd, along the same track they walked every week, with the bride somewhere in the middle of it, and the neighbours all around her and children running ahead and coming back and running ahead again. There were garlands. There were armfuls of whatever was flowering and greenery cut that morning, and, where a village could manage it, a piper making a cheerful noise at the front. It was a procession in the same easy way that a village going anywhere together is a procession, noisy, unrehearsed, and entirely unsolemn. And then they reached the church, and they did not go in. It was a proper little room, built onto the side or the western end of the church, with a stone bench running along one wall or along both, a roof against the rain, and the great door at the back of it, its iron hinges spreading across the wood like the branches of a tree. In the churches where those benches survive, the stone is worn into shallow dips, because for several hundred years this was where the parish did its business. And that is what the porch was for, the room where the ordinary world and the sacred world touched each other. Debts were paid there. Oaths were sworn there. Agreements were witnessed there, because a promise made at the church door, in front of the neighbours, was about as binding as a promise could be made in a world with very little paperwork. The first part of a baptism began at the door, before the child was carried inside. It was the threshold, in the fullest sense of the word, and a wedding is a threshold ceremony if ever there was one. So the crowd packs into the porch and spills back out of it into the churchyard. The priest comes out to them, rather than waiting for them within. And the marriage begins in the open air. He asks the questions first. Is there any impediment, any reason, in law or in blood or in prior promise, why these two may not be joined? He asks it of the couple, and he asks it of everybody standing there, and this is not theatre. He genuinely wanted to know, because a good deal of the trouble the medieval church had with marriage came from people who had already promised themselves to somebody else and had, let us say, chosen not to dwell on it. He asks whether each of them comes freely of their own will. The Mass would be in Latin, and the blessings would be in Latin, and the priest's own words over them would be in Latin. But the words that actually made the marriage were said in the ordinary spoken tongue of that place, in English or French or German or Italian, in whatever dialect the couple had. And then he steps back a little, because the next part is not his to do. Now the couple speak, and here is the second surprise of the day. They spoke in their own language, not Latin. Been arguing and joking and haggling in all their lives. This was deliberate. The consent had to be understood by the couple and by the witnesses, or it was not consent at all. In many places they joined right hands as they said it, sometimes with the priest's stole laid over their joined hands, so that everyone crowded into that little stone room could see the promise as well as hear it. And the words themselves are startling, because they are already familiar. The old English forms, the ones written into the service books used across much of medieval England, ran something like this: I take thee to my wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us depart. Some of the older versions add a further clause, promising all this if Holy Church will so ordain it. And that last phrase has drifted a little over the centuries into till death us do part, though the older word was depart in its older sense, meaning to separate, to divide one thing from another. Till death divides us. The bride said the same words back, with one or two additions that varied from region to region. In some of the older forms, her promise included the words bonny and buxom, which in the language of the time meant something closer to gracious, cheerful, and obliging. Words drift. That one drifted further than most. Those vows are a formula that has been in continuous use, with barely any alteration, for something like 800 years. It has outlived the version of English it was first written down in. Chaucer would have recognized it. So, very likely, would a bride of 100 years ago. Now, the priest. He is standing right there in his vestments, and everyone has come to church, and so it feels obvious what he is doing. He is marrying them. Except that in the medieval understanding, he was not. And this is the single most important fact in the whole of this episode, the one that everything else rests on. The priest witnessed and blessed. He did not create the marriage. The couple created it themselves by consenting to each other. The theologians of the 12th century worked this out, the schools of Paris in particular, and the conclusion the church settled on was extraordinary. Marriage was the one sacrament that the two people involved administered to each other. The priest was not the maker of it. He was the most respectable witness in the room. You can see the reasoning. Consent freely given was the heart of it, because a marriage nobody had agreed to was no marriage at all, and the church defended that principle stubbornly, sometimes against very unhappy families. But you can also see, immediately, the enormous door this leaves standing open. If the couple make the marriage by consenting, and the priest is a witness rather than a maker, then what exactly is the standing of two people who consent to each other with no priest present at all? Under a tree. In a barn. In its plainest form, the law recognized that words spoken in the present tense made a binding marriage on the spot, while a promise about the future became binding once the couple afterwards lived together as husband and wife. That is a legal principle, dry as a ledger, and it will matter enormously later on. For now, back to the porch, where nobody is thinking about canon law and somebody's toddler has got hold of a garland. The ring comes next. The groom lays it down, along with some coins of gold and silver, on the priest's book, or on a small dish held out for the purpose, and the priest blesses it with holy water. Then the ring is given, and in the English rite it is not simply pushed straight onto the finger. It is touched to the thumb in the name of the Father, and to the first finger, and of the Son, and to the second finger, and of the Holy Ghost, and then set at last upon the fourth finger. Amen. 4 small movements, one for each part of the blessing, and then it stays. The ring itself might be a plain band of whatever metal the household could manage. Gold if you were fortunate, silver if you were doing well enough, and something humbler if you were not. Grander rings sometimes carried a short line of writing on the inside of the band, hidden against the skin, a phrase or a prayer that nobody else would ever read. And it was not unknown, in the poorer parishes, for a ring to be borrowed for the morning and handed quietly back afterwards, since what mattered in law was the giving and the words, and not the value of the metal. Why the fourth finger of the left hand? Because of a belief inherited from the ancient world that a single vein ran from that finger directly to the heart. It is said that a Roman writer recorded the idea and attributed it to older Egyptian teaching, and it was simply passed down the centuries unexamined, the way lovely ideas often are, until it arrived in a damp English porch 1,000 years later and put a ring on a farmer's daughter's hand. It is not anatomically true. It never was. It is one of the most durable pieces of misinformation in human history, and nobody has ever much wanted to correct it. And as he gives the ring, the groom says the other line that is already familiar. With this ring I thee wed. This gold and silver I thee give. With my body I thee honour, which in the English of the time meant to show her honour and respect. And with all my worldly goods I thee endow. That last clause was not a flourish. It was the legal business of the day, and it was said at the door on purpose. Because at this exact moment, in front of everybody, the husband named the dower, not the dowry, which came the other way, from her family into the marriage. The dower was what she would receive from him if she outlived him, and in English law it was so firmly attached to this moment that it had its own name in the law books, the dower at the church door. He would say aloud what lands, what house, what share of what he had would be hers for the rest of her life if he died first. Commonly 1/3 of his holdings, though the amount could be agreed otherwise, and it was named specifically enough that people could argue about it afterwards. And that is exactly why it was said outdoors, and loudly, and in front of the entire parish. In a world where most people could not read, and where documents were rare, expensive, and easily lost in a fire, the reliable archive was the memory of the neighbours. 20 years on, when the husband was dead and his brother had decided to be difficult about the land, the widow's case rested on the older men of the parish standing up and saying, "I was there, I heard him say it, it was the year the mill flooded." The crowd in that churchyard was not an audience. The crowd was the paperwork. There is a related custom, said to have been practised in some places, of walking the parish boundaries and fixing the markers in the memory of the village boys by giving each of them a small and memorable knock at everyone. The theory was the same, if slightly less gentle. Now, what everyone was wearing, because this is the part that most pictures get wrong, there is no white dress. White comes very much later. What people wore to a medieval wedding was, quite simply, the best they had. And if there was any money at all, it went into colour, because colour was expensive. Dye was labour. A deep red took madder and mordance and skill. A good yellow took weld. Blue came from woad, and the truest blues came dear. A bright garment announced that this household could afford brightness, and that was precisely the message it was meant to send. Blue was a common choice for a bride, being associated with purity and with faithfulness, and there is a certain sweetness in the thought that our something blue has that much history behind it. The bride very often wore her hair loose, unbraided and uncovered, falling down her back with a garland of flowers on it, or of worked gold thread if the family could rise to it. For a married woman in this world, whose hair would be covered nearly every day of her life afterwards, this was one of the few occasions on which it was not, and it was the visible marker of the crossing she was making. It must have been beautiful in that spring light. The groom, meanwhile, stood beside her in his good tunic, feeling conspicuous, as grooms have felt since the beginning of time. Then, and only then, the doors open, and the whole crowd goes inside. The nuptial mass follows, and after the noise of the churchyard, the inside of the church is a different climate altogether. Cool. Dim. Smelling of stone and candle smoke, and of the greenery that somebody has piled along the screen. The couple kneeled before the altar, and in many regions a cloth was brought out and held over them, a care cloth spread above their heads and held at its four corners while the priest said the great blessing. Under that canopy, for a little while, they were hidden from everyone, which is a rather kind thing to do to two people who have just spent an hour being looked at by every neighbour they have. And in some of the English uses there is one last gesture. At the kiss of peace, which in the mass is passed from one person to the next, the priest gave it to the husband, and the husband turned and gave it to his wife. Peace handed along from the altar to him to her. Then the mass ended, and they came back out through the porch where it had all been said, into the full light of the middle of the morning, and the noise started up again at once, and the shouting, and the flowers, and somebody's dog. Because the solemn part was finished now, and every single person standing in that churchyard was thinking about the same thing. The feast. And when the words at the door had been said, and the priest had led them in under the arch for the mass, and the last blessing had been given over them at the altar, there came a kind of pause, the small held breath of a crowd waiting to be let go, somebody's baby grizzling somewhere near the back, the smell of cold stone and candle smoke, and then the doors opening again onto the ordinary daylight of an ordinary field, and the whole business turning, quite suddenly, from solemn into something else entirely. Because the part of a medieval wedding that people actually remembered, the part they talked about for years afterwards, was not the vows. It was the dinner. It is worth pausing on how enormous that dinner was in the life of an ordinary family. We are used to thinking of a wedding as one expense among many, sitting alongside a house and a car and a holiday. For a village family in the 14th century, the wedding feast might well be the single largest meal they would ever host, and quite possibly the largest gathering their household would ever be responsible for. Not the largest that year. The largest ever. The food and drink could easily cost more than everything else about the wedding put together, more than the ring, more than the clothes, more than whatever small sums went to the priest and the clerk. A family might spend a year quietly preparing, grain set aside, a pig fattened with a particular date in mind, malt bought in autumn for ale that would not be drunk until spring. And the reason they did it was not vanity, or not only vanity. A wedding was a public event in the truest sense. The whole point of the day, from the church door onwards, was that everybody could see it and everybody could later swear to it. So the feast was not a private celebration to which one issued invitations, it was the community's occasion. People came because they were neighbours, because they were kin, because they were the sort of distant kin who could not be quite placed, but were certainly related to somebody's aunt, and because a wedding was, in a real way, public property. Someone might turn up who had not been asked. That was expected. Turning them away would have been strange and rather mean-spirited, and a poor showing for a household that was, that very day, announcing that it existed. There is a practical afterthought to all this. When a marriage was later questioned before the church courts, the people called to speak with the people who had eaten the dinner, and what they remembered tended to be the ordinary furniture of the day, the weather, the ale, who had sat beside whom. The feast was not only a party. It was, in the plainest sense, the evidence. The cost of it fell most often on the bride's family, and it fell heavily. It is said that families sometimes went into debt for a daughter's wedding dinner, and there were certainly arrangements by which relatives and neighbours clubbed together in advance, each bringing a measure of grain, a cheese, a bird, so that the burden did not land on one purse. This was ordinary. It is one of the quiet things about medieval village life that keeps surfacing wherever you look. An enormous amount of practical mutual help, arranged informally, remembered carefully, and repaid later when it was your turn. But the English had an especially elegant solution to the problem of the ruinous wedding feast, and it is one of my favourite corners of the whole subject, partly because a word you use all the time is fossilised inside it. The bride's family brewed the ale. A great deal of it, weeks in advance, in the largest vessels the household or the parish could muster, with molten water and the slow warmth of fermentation filling some outbuilding with a smell like wet bread. Brewing at that scale was very often women's work. And then, when the day came, they sold it. Guests drank, and paid for what they drank, and paid generously, because everyone understood that they were not really buying ale at all. They were making a contribution to a new household that had nothing in it yet. The money went to the couple. It bought a cooking pot, a bed, a few tools, the beginnings of a life. This was called a bride ale. And the word ale, in that period, meant not only the drink but the gathering built around it. There were church ales, held to raise money to mend a roof or buy candles. There were help ales, held for a family that had suffered some misfortune. The bride ale was that same generous machinery pointed at a happy occasion. And bride ale, worn smooth over centuries in the mouths of people who no longer brewed anything, became the word bridal. When we say a bridal gown or a bridal party, we are using, without knowing it, a word that once meant a party at which beer was sold so that two young people could afford the furniture of a first home. I find that entirely delightful. It helps to picture where all this happened, because it was very rarely a room built for the purpose. In a village, the feast spilled outdoors if the weather allowed, into the churchyard or a barn, or the widest part of somebody's yard, on trestle tables, which were exactly what the name suggests. Boards laid across folding supports, put up that morning and taken down again that night. Benches borrowed from 3 houses, cloths borrowed from 4. A great deal of counting of bowls beforehand, and some quiet anxiety about whether there would be enough. And more often than not, the light falling over all of it was spring light. The church kept closed seasons in which weddings were not solemnized, Lent chief among them, and Advent as well, so couples who had been waiting through the dark months came pouring out the moment the season opened again. Weddings clustered after Easter, and again in the slack weeks of early summer before the hay had to be cut, and again after harvest, when there was food in the house and a little money in it. Which means the archetypal medieval wedding feast is happening in that thin, low golden light of an afternoon in April, on tables set slightly unevenly on grass, with the year's first real warmth on everybody's shoulders. What was actually on the table depended, as everything in the Middle Ages depended, on who you were. At a peasant wedding, the shape of the meal would have been familiar, food made abundant, which is exactly what a feast means when you are ordinarily hungry. Bread, and a lot of it. Dense loaves of mixed wheat and rye. Pottage, that endlessly adaptable thickened stew of grain and beans and whatever green things the season allowed, but made rich for once, made with meat stock, made with more in it than usual. Cheese, cut in generous wedges rather than shaved thin. Bacon. If the family could manage it, roast fowl, geese, or hens, turned over the fire, the fat spitting and catching, that smell drifting out across the yard and doing more to summon the neighbours than any invitation could. Perhaps a whole pig, if it had been a good year. Butter. Onions. Apples in autumn, or a dish of stewed fruit sweetened with honey. And ale running through all of it, the constant cheerful undertow of the day. It was not delicate food. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be the day on which nobody had to think about the size of their portion, and for people who spent most of the year thinking rather carefully about the size of their portion, that is a profound kind of luxury. At the other end of society, in a great household, the wedding dinner became architecture. Several courses, each one a parade of dishes brought in together, so that the table filled and emptied and filled again. Roast meats in real quantity, beef and mutton and venison, and birds of every kind, because birds at a grand table were a language of their own, from ordinary capons up through swan and peacock and heron. Pies with pastry walls built tall enough to stand on their own. Blancmange, which despite the modern name was a pale, gentle dish of pounded chicken with almond milk and rice and sugar. Fromenty, wheat simmered slowly in milk and coloured gold with saffron, the traditional partner to venison. Custards and tarts and little sweet fried things. A dinner on that scale ran on ceremony as much as on cookery. Servants came round first with ewers of water and long towels, so that everyone could wash their hands at table, which mattered rather a lot in a world where fingers did much of the work a fork does now. Guests were seated by rank, the most important nearest the head of the table, with the great salt cellar standing on the high table like a small silver monument and quietly marking where importance ended. People ate in pairs or in fours, sharing a dish between them, which meant that your neighbour at a wedding dinner was not a matter of small talk, but of genuine practical cooperation. You were, for the next several hours, eating out of the same bowl. Bread served as a plate, thick slices of day-old loaf, called trenchers, soaked up the sauces and were afterwards gathered into the alms dish and given away at the gate to whoever had come to wait there, which was a real and expected part of any large feast. And at the very end, in the grandest households, there came a last small offering of spiced sweet wine and thin crisp wafers, taken standing as a kind of full stop. And running through all of it, spice. Spice everywhere, and openly so, because spice was the most legible way to say money without saying it out loud. Pepper and ginger and cinnamon and cloves, and above all saffron, which turned things a deep and gorgeous yellow and cost a small fortune to do so. A wealthy medieval kitchen liked its flavours strong, sweet and sharp at the same time, sugar and vinegar and warm spice in the same sauce. To a modern tongue, much of it would taste rather like a very rich mulled wine that had somehow become dinner. It was not subtle, except in one particular sense, because between the courses at a really grand feast there came the thing that was actually called a subtlety, a subtlety was a sculpture, made of sugar paste, or marzipan, or a stiff modelling paste of almonds and sugar, coloured and gilded and built into whatever the household's imagination and purse could support. A castle with towers, a ship in full sail, a garden, a saint, a heraldic beast belonging to one family clasping the beast of the other, which at a wedding was not decoration but argument, a whole diplomatic statement rendered in confectionery. Sometimes the figures carried tiny scrolls with mottos or verses written on them, so that the sugar could quite literally speak. And the point of it was that it was carried in and set down, and everybody looked at it and admired it and did not eat it. It was there to be seen. It was the medieval equivalent of the moment when everyone at a modern wedding reaches for a phone at once. Which brings us, gently, to cake, and to a small piece of honesty. There is a lovely and much repeated custom in which guests each bring a small cake or spiced bun and pile them into a heap in the middle of the table, and the couple are made to lean over the tower of buns and kiss across it without knocking the whole thing down. If they manage it, prosperity and happiness are promised. If they do not, everybody laughs, which is arguably the real purpose. It is a charming image, and it is the ancestor, in spirit, of the tiered cake with its little figures on top. But I should say plainly that the firm evidence for that piled cake game comes from after the Middle Ages, and the tall iced wedding cake we would recognise is later, still, a thing of the 17th and 18th centuries and beyond. What medieval weddings certainly did have were cakes and spiced breads of various kinds, brought and shared and broken up, sometimes handed out for luck. So the honest version is this: the ingredients of the tradition were there, the piling and the kissing came afterwards, and somewhere in between, over a great many weddings, one grew out of the other. Customs tend to arrive that way, quietly, so that nobody notices until they are old enough to be called ancient. Then there was noise. Music at a village wedding most often meant pipe and tabor, which is one player doing two jobs at once, a three-holed pipe fingered with the left hand, while the right hand beats a small drum slung at the elbow. It makes a bright, slightly nasal, thoroughly danceable sound that carries a remarkable distance across open ground. Add a fiddle, a bagpipe of the rough country sort, somebody with a set of small bells, and you have a wedding band. In a great hall there would be more, harps and shawms and trumpets to announce the courses, but the tune the ordinary parish danced to came from one man with a pipe and a good deal of stamina. And the dancing was not the sort where couples pair off and the rest watch. Medieval dancing, at its most common, was a carol, a ring or a line, hands joined, everybody moving together, with a leader singing the verse and the whole company answering back on the refrain. Old women danced. Children ran in and out of the ring and got underfoot. The ground got trodden into a smooth patch. The singing went on until people were hoarse, and then it went on a little longer, and the sound of it drifted across the fields to whoever had stayed behind minding the animals, who would have known exactly what it was and roughly whose it was, and would have felt, hearing it, a little left out. There was teasing too, a great deal of teasing, of the loud, red-faced, unsubtle kind that villages have always been good at. Jokes at the expense of both bride and groom, and particularly at the expense of anyone who had been notably slow about getting married. In some places, it is said, a rope was drawn across the road so that the couple had to pay a toll of coins or drink before they could pass. In others, the groom threw handfuls of small coins for the children to scramble after. Grain was flung over the pair for fruitfulness, and some accounts suggest that this is the distant ancestor of the rice and confetti we throw now. Races were run, wrestling happened, somebody always fell over. It was rough, but it was affectionate. The whole village was enjoying itself at the couple's expense, precisely because the couple now belonged to the village in a new way, and that is what the noise was for. It said, "We saw this, we were here, this is ours, as well as yours." And then, at some point in the long afternoon, the gifts. Not wrapped, and not romantic. A cooking pot which was a serious gift and might last a lifetime. A blanket. A chest. A hen, or a young pig, or in a generous year a sheep, handed over on a string with instructions about its temperament. Spoons. A knife. Linen. Tools for whichever trade the husband followed. Small coins pressed into a hand, or dropped into a dish, with the sort of gruff mumble that means, "Please do not make a fuss about this." Every one of those things was a vote of confidence in a household that morning, had not existed. Which is, when you look at it steadily, exactly what a wedding present still is. We have simply replaced the hen. A medieval wedding does not so much end as slowly dissolve into the evening. There is no moment when someone stands up and announces that the celebration is over. Instead, the light in the hall simply changes. The high windows, if there are any, go from gold to grey to a soft ink blue, and somebody notices that the far end of the table has become difficult to see, and rushlights are lit, and the tallow candles, and the fire is fed again, and the whole room shrinks inward towards the warm middle of itself. The talk gets slower and lower. The children who were running between the benches an hour ago have gone quiet in corners, folded over like small sacks of grain. Someone is still singing, but not loudly now, and not to anybody in particular. Outside, the evening smells of wood smoke and turned earth, and the sharp green of hedges only lately come into leaf. And there is that particular chill that arrives. An hour or so after sunset in spring, the one that makes people who have been sitting a long time reach quietly for their cloaks. And then, at some point that everyone recognizes without anyone naming it, the wedding leaves the hall and goes out into the lane. This was one of the loveliest parts of the whole day, and one of the least private. The bride and groom did not slip discreetly away. They were escorted. The guests took up torches, or lanterns, or simply the ends of burning sticks from the hearth, and the entire company walked the couple to whatever door they were going to live behind. In a village this might be a walk of 200 paces down a rutted track, past the same barns and pig pens, everybody passed every day of their lives. In a town it might be through 3 narrow streets, under overhanging upper stories, with the neighbours leaning out to watch. And it was noisy. It was meant to be noisy. There was singing, and there were pipes and drums if the village had them, and if it did not, there were pot lids and ladles and a great deal of shouting, and people banged whatever they had against whatever else they had, and the dogs joined in, because dogs always join in. Very often the bride's belongings went with her in that procession, carried by hand in full view, her chest, if she had one, borne between 2 men who were not entirely steady after the afternoon, her bedding folded and roped. Whatever linen and cloth she had been putting aside for years, and any small livestock that formed part of what she brought with her, which occasionally meant a sheep being persuaded down a dark lane by torchlight in the middle of a wedding party, with mixed results. It was a removal as much as a celebration. Everything she owned was going through a door, and it would not be coming back out. It is easy to hear that racket as simple high spirits, and a good deal of it certainly was. But there was something else in it too, something that mattered a great deal to people who kept very few written records of their own lives. The noise was the community putting its signature on the day. A marriage in this world was not principally a private feeling. It was a public fact, and public facts had to be witnessed loudly enough that nobody could later claim not to have heard. Half a village walking down a dark lane behind two people with torches, making an appalling din, was in its own way a legal document. Years afterwards, if any question ever arose about whether these two were truly husband and wife, there would be dozens of people who could stand up in a church court and say, "I was there. I carried a light. I remember the noise. I remember which door they went in at." And the same instruments could be turned the other way, which tells you what they were for. When a village disapproved of a match, the neighbours might gather outside that house and make exactly the same kind of clamour, only without the affection in it. The custom went by different names in different places, and it was never a comfortable evening for anyone inside. The pots and the shouting were the community's voice, and the community used its voice both to bless and to grumble. At the door there was one more piece of formal business, and it deserves to be described plainly, because it is often misunderstood. The marriage bed was blessed. This was a real and well-documented custom across much of medieval Christendom. The priest, who had been at the church porch that morning, and very probably at the feast all afternoon, came into the chamber and blessed the room and the bed with prayers, sprinkling holy water, and asking God for peace in this household, for concord between these two people, and for children. Then he left. The guests who had crowded to the doorway to see it said their good nights, and went away down the lane with their torches, and the door was closed, and that is the whole of what there is to say about it. To modern ears the custom can sound surprising. To medieval people it was not surprising at all, and the reason is worth a moment. The church blessed things. It blessed fields before sowing, and ships before sailing, and bread, and beehives, and animals, and houses. A new household was a new thing in the world, a small economy and a small community with a hearth at the centre of it, and it was blessed the way a field was blessed, out loud in front of neighbours, with prayers for it to be fruitful and peaceful. A room was prayed over. Then everyone went home, which raises the question of whose room it actually was. And here the romantic picture of a young couple crossing the threshold into their own little cottage runs into the hard economics of medieval life. Very often the couple did not go to a house of their own, because there was no house of their own. They went into an existing household, usually the husband's parents, sometimes the bride's, and there they lived, in a home already full of people, with an older generation still very much in charge of the pots and the fire and the decisions. In peasant society, whether a young couple could set up independently depended almost entirely on one thing, and it was not love, and it was not savings. It was whether there was land available. Land was finite. A holding could only be divided so many times before it stopped feeding anybody. So a family with one viable holding and 3 sons had, in practical terms, one marriage it could easily accommodate, and the others had to find land elsewhere, or wait, or go into service, or leave altogether. This produced one of the quiet institutions of medieval rural life. The retirement arrangement and the manorial records are full of them. An aging couple would hand over the holding to a son and his new wife, and in exchange the son undertook to maintain them for the rest of their lives, and the terms were written down in the manor court with a precision that is genuinely touching and slightly comic. The old people were to have a certain measure of grain each year, and a place by the fire, and sometimes a specified corner of the house, and a particular cow, and in some agreements a stated quantity of ale. People knew exactly how much friction there was going to be between 2 generations under one roof, and they tried to write their way around it in advance, which is a very human thing to do, and which never entirely works. Whether the couple had their own roof or a corner of somebody else's, they were now sitting up as an economic unit, and the first year of a marriage was mostly about equipment. This is where all those wedding gifts stopped being sentiment and became inventory. The money collected at the bride ale, the household goods that came with the dowry, the presents from kin and neighbours, all of it went into the same practical pile. A cooking pot, which was expensive and would last for decades. Bedding, which mattered far more than we tend to imagine. A chest. A trestle and boards. Perhaps a cow or a few sheep or a breeding sow given by one family or the other. Tools, if the husband had a trade, and the tools of a trade were among the most valuable things a modest man ever owned. It is hard now to feel how few things a household contained. The entire movable wealth of a comfortable peasant family could be listed on a short strip of parchment, and frequently was, when the manor took its account. One good pot hanging over the fire, and everything the family ate came out of it, day after day, year after year, until the metal wore thin at the bottom and somebody paid to have it mended rather than replaced. A knife each. A few wooden bowls, a jug, a bucket, a salting tub. Objects were not disposable, and so they were noticed and remembered and argued about and left to people by name. Medieval wills give this away beautifully. When ordinary people wrote down what they wanted to leave behind, the items that recur are not jewels and not silver. They are beds and bedding, brass pots, a best gown, a cow, a chest. The bed in particular turns up again and again as a serious bequest, named and described and left carefully to a particular person, because a good bed with its hangings and coverings represented an enormous amount of labour and money. A young couple starting out with a decent bed and a decent pot were starting out well, and both families knew it. And the couple themselves, standing in that doorway with their pot and their bedding and their borrowed corner, were very likely older than most people assume. This is worth stating clearly, because the popular picture is inaccurate. Across most of northwestern Europe, ordinary people married comparatively late. Historians working through the surviving records have found men and women commonly marrying in their 20s, and the reason is exactly the one we have just been talking about. You could not marry until you could keep a household, and keeping a household required land, or a trade, or savings. So young people spent their late teens and early 20s working, very often as servants in other people's houses, earning and accumulating and waiting for a holding or a workshop or a tenancy to come free. Marriage was the reward at the end of that waiting. It was not the beginning of adult life, but the confirmation of it. The very young marriages that people imagine when they think of the Middle Ages were largely an elite affair, arranged among noble and royal families, where the point was land, inheritance and alliance rather than the founding of a working household. Even in those cases, the arrangement was frequently a betrothal on parchment rather than a shared life, with the two families continuing to live entirely apart for years afterwards. It was a treaty between estates, negotiated by adults, and it belonged to a very small slice of society. For the overwhelming majority of medieval people, the ordinary ones in the villages and the market towns, marriage came in the 20s after years of work. Not every marriage was a success, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. So let us deal with what happened when things went wrong, and let us deal with it the way the Middle Ages did, which is to say, as paperwork. a valid marriage was held to be permanent, and no court and no bishop could dissolve one. But the same law that made marriage indissoluble also made it extremely technical, and that created an opening. If a marriage could be shown never to have been valid in the first place, then in law it had never existed, and the parties were free. That was annulment, and it was not a dissolution but a finding of fact. The grounds were the ones the law cared about. That one of the parties had already been bound by a prior promise to somebody else. That the two were related within the forbidden degrees. That consent had not been freely given. That one of them had been married already. So the church courts filled up with this kind of business, and reading their records is like reading the records of any tribunal anywhere. There are witnesses summoned and witnesses failing to appear. There are clerks writing everything down in abbreviated Latin. There are adjournments and proctors and citations and cases that grind on for years over the question of who said what to whom in a garden 6 summers ago. It is administration rather than scandal, and the people who worked in those courts seem to have approached it with the weary patience of officials everywhere. There was also a middle path, and it was used. A couple whose life together had become impossible could be granted a separation from bed and board. They lived apart. Property arrangements were made. But they remained married in law, and neither could marry anyone else while the other lived. It was a legal acknowledgement that two people should not be sharing a house, combined with a firm refusal to pretend the marriage had gone away. And then there was the ending that came to most marriages, which was simply death, and which brings us back to that promise made at the church door in the morning. Because the dower, that portion of the husband's property named publicly in front of everyone before they ever went inside, was not a piece of ceremonial decoration. It was the widow's security, and in English common law it was commonly reckoned as 1/3 of the lands the husband had held, hers for the rest of her life. When he died, she did not lose everything and go back to her father. She had a stated claim, and the whole village had heard it stated. And here is one of the genuine surprises of medieval social history. Widows were frequently the most legally independent women in that world. A widow could hold land in her own name. She could sue and be sued. In many towns she could carry on her late husband's trade, keep his workshop, take on apprentices, buy and sell, and answer for herself. Brewers and alewives, weavers, dyers, merchants trading in their own right, women running substantial businesses and appearing in the records doing it. Which is also why a widow with land was such an interesting prospect to her neighbours. Having seen what the alternative looked like, declined to remarry at all, and are recorded managing their affairs quite happily on their own for another. A woman who had married in her 20s, run a household for 30 years and buried her husband, might well spend her last decades as the most autonomous person in her family. 20 years. They had arrived, in a sense, at a position no other woman in that society could occupy. Married once, answerable now to nobody, and holding the land to prove it, all of which rested in the end on words. On a dower named aloud at a porch. On witnesses who remembered a noisy walk down a lane and the smell of the torches, and which door it was. On the plain fact of two people having said yes in front of their neighbours. And it is precisely there, in those spoken words, that medieval marriage law becomes very strange indeed. And here, having walked all the way through it, the porch, the priest, the ring, the ale, the neighbours crowding in at the door, here is where the tidy picture we have been building begins, very gently, to come apart. Because the truly astonishing thing about marriage in the medieval church is that almost none of what we have just described was, strictly speaking, necessary at all. Not the priest, not the porch, not the ring, or the ale, or the neighbours, or the blessing, or the feast. All of it was proper. All of it was expected. All of it made a marriage public and respectable and defensible. But none of it was the thing that actually made two people married. What made two people married was that they said so. From roughly the middle of the 12th century, the canon lawyers of the Western Church settled on a principle that is, on reflection, quietly extraordinary. The thing that created a marriage was consent, the free consent of the two people involved, expressed in words to each other. That was the whole of it. That was the sacrament. Everything else was ornament, however beautiful and however earnestly the Church wished you would bother with it. This did not arrive out of nowhere or without argument. There was a long and genuinely absorbing debate among the great teachers of the 12th century about what the essential ingredient was. In Bologna, the canonist Gratian took the view that consent began a marriage and that consummation completed it. In the end, in the second half of the 12th century, the papacy arrived at a settlement that leaned heavily toward Paris. It is usually associated with the pontificate of Alexander III, and it was that settlement which governed marriage across Latin Christendom for the next 400. In Paris, the theologian Peter Lombard argued that consent alone was enough, and pointed to the marriage of Mary and Joseph as the case that proved it, a marriage everyone agreed was a true marriage, and one the Bologna position had some difficulty accounting for. Years. Consent, freely given in the present tense, made a marriage on the spot. Immediately. Completely. And, once made, it could not be undone. The consequence of that, once you follow it out, is enormous and slightly comic, and it caused a very great deal of trouble. It meant that two people could marry each other anywhere, absolutely anywhere. In a garden, in a tavern, on a bench, with the fire going, under a tree at the edge of a field, in a barn while the rain came down and they waited for it to stop, leaning on a gate, with the sheep in the next field entirely uninterested in the legal history being made a few feet away. No priest, no witnesses, no church, no candles, no ring, no notice given to anybody at all, only two people, and the words. It is worth pausing on how utterly ordinary that would have looked from the outside. A young man and a young woman standing in an orchard in the low gold light of a spring evening, with the blossom going over and the grass damp at the ankles, saying something to one another that neither of them may entirely have understood the weight of. He takes her right hand in his right hand, because that is how it is done, and everybody knows it. Perhaps he gives her a ring, or a coin, or a length of ribbon. Somewhere behind the hedge a cousin is pretending very hard not to be listening. And that is a marriage. Complete, from that moment, for the rest of their lives. It was irregular, it was disorderly, and it was, in the eyes of every sensible parish priest in Europe, a headache waiting to happen. And it was completely, unarguably valid. That is the strange law at the heart of this whole episode. The church could tell you that you had done it improperly. The church could not tell you that you had not done it. What the church offered instead of prohibition was publicity, and it pushed publicity extremely hard. That is what the bans were. The announcement of an intended marriage read out in the parish church on 3 separate Sundays, so that anybody who knew of a genuine reason why these two people could not lawfully marry each other had a proper and unhurried opportunity to say so out loud. The requirement is generally traced to the great council held at the Lateran early in the 13th century, and the thinking behind it was thoroughly practical. In a world without central records, the bans were an enormous shared memory being consulted, 3 Sundays running. Very nearly the only reliable way anyone had of discovering whether a marriage was possible before it was made. A clandestine marriage skipped all of that, which is precisely why the church minded so much. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing hum, and it is a detail about grammar. Because it mattered enormously, it mattered more than almost anything else in the medieval law of marriage, exactly which tense you had used. Words in the present tense created a marriage instantly. I take thee as my wife. I take thee as my husband. The lawyers called these words of present consent, and the moment they were exchanged freely by two people capable of marrying, a marriage existed. Not a promise of a marriage. A marriage. Words in the future tense created something quite different. I will take thee as my wife. I shall marry you at Michaelmas. That was a betrothal, a binding and serious engagement, certainly, something the church took very seriously indeed and would hold you to, but not yet a marriage. There was still, in theory, a door. Unless. And here is the hinge on which so many cases turned. If a couple exchanged words of future consent, and the promise was afterwards followed by consummation, then the law treated the betrothal as having become a marriage. The future tense collapsed into the present. The promise ripened into the thing itself, without anybody saying another word about it. It means that the whole immense weight of a medieval marriage, property, inheritance, the standing of children, the household, the rest of 2 lives, could come down to whether somebody had said, I take or I will take, on a summer evening 8 months ago, in a garden where nobody was, really. That is the legal principle exactly as the canon lawyers framed it, a rule about status and evidence, and nothing else. But do notice what it means. Listening. And so, inevitably, the church courts filled up. The records survive in quantity, and they are one of the great pleasures of medieval social history, because they preserve ordinary people talking about their own lives in a way that almost nothing else from that world does. The consistory court of York holds a famous run of them, so do the courts of Ely and Canterbury and their equivalents across the continent. And what they contain, over and over again, is people arguing about words. A woman comes to the court and says that a man married her on such a day, in such a place, with such words. The man appears and says that he said no such thing, or that he said something like it, but in the future, tense, as a hope rather than a vow. Or that he said it in jest. Or that he said it, but that she had already promised herself to somebody else, and so was not free to hear it. Families arrive to discover, to their considerable horror, that a son or a daughter has already contracted a marriage with somebody entirely unsuitable, and that the careful arrangement they have been negotiating with a neighbouring family is now legally impossible, because the child said the words, and the words were enough, and no amount of parental fury could unsay them. Occasionally 2 different people appear, each claiming the same spouse, each with a story, each with a date, each with a handful of neighbours prepared to remember it their way. And the court, patiently, has to work out which alleged marriage happened first, because the first one is the real one, and everything after it is nothing at all. Which brings us to the evidence, and the evidence is where it becomes properly impossible. Because in most places, for most of this period, there were no marriage registers, no book, no parchment with a seal on it recording that on this day these 2 people were joined. That comes later. So the case is turned on human memory, on what the neighbours had heard and thought they had heard and were prepared to swear to. The court would ask with enormous seriousness what precisely were the words. Who else was in the room? Was a ring given, and on which finger, and did she keep it? Was there a gift, a coin, a brooch, a pair of gloves, a piece of silver bent in half in the way people bent a coin to mark a promise? Did they drink together afterwards, and did the others present drink with them? Because drinking together afterwards was how a whole village understood that something had been settled, and people would answer, patiently, years later, from memory. An old woman who had been carding wool by the door would say that she heard him say the words, and that he took her right hand in his. A man would say he had been in the same room and heard nothing of the kind. Someone else would recall that there had been a ring, but was not certain who had given it to whom, and had a vague sense that it had been a Thursday. None of this was theatre, incidentally. These courts were not scenes of high drama, they were administration. A room with a clerk in it, and a proctor, and a book of Latin formulas, and adjournments, and a great deal of waiting about. The clerks wrote it all down in a small, tired hand, abbreviating heavily, and their abbreviations are the reason we know what ordinary people said about their neighbours' courtships 600 and 700 years ago. The courts were not scandalised. They had heard everything already. They were simply establishing who was married to whom, so that the parish could get on with itself. So why on earth did the church allow this, when a single line requiring a priest would have solved it overnight? It followed from something the church believed very deeply, and it was willing to pay for it. Consent was a matter of the soul. Marriage was a sacrament, and a sacrament could not be conjured out of somebody who did not want it. A marriage entered into under compulsion, a woman dragged to the door by her family, a man frightened into agreement, was not a bad marriage or an unfortunate marriage. It was not a marriage at all. It was void. It had never existed. That, incidentally, is what an annulment actually was, not the ending of a marriage, but a finding that there had never been one to end. And once you hold that principle, the rest follows whether you like it or not. If consent is what makes a marriage, then consent freely given must make a marriage, and it cannot suddenly stop making one merely because it was given in a garden rather than a porch, or without a priest standing by, or in the face of the family's absolute opposition. That rule protected people. It protected servants, and the poor, and the young, and above all, it gave women a genuine legal instrument in a world that gave them very few. A woman could go to a church court on her own account and say, "He married me," and the court would hear her, and take depositions, and weigh them, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, find in her favour against a man who very much wished it otherwise. In a society organised almost entirely around property and family strategy, canon law held one small stubborn door open, and written on it was the thought that what the two of them wanted was what counted. And when a clandestine marriage was proven, the court did not undo it. It could not. The couple would be admonished for having gone about it improperly, given some modest penance, and then instructed to go and have the thing solemnized properly in church, in the daylight, with the banns read, with the priest present and the parish looking on, exactly as it should have been done in. What it did instead was simply tidy it up. The first place. The marriage had existed all along, from that evening in the orchard. The ceremony, when it finally arrived, was not what made it. It was the paperwork. The price of that open door was 400 years of magnificent legal confusion. The church knew it went on paying, and then, in the 16th century, it stopped. At the Council of Trent in 1563, the Catholic Church issued the decree that finally closed the loophole. From then on, for Catholics, a marriage had to be celebrated in the presence of the parish priest and a small number of witnesses. Not merely ought to be, had to be. A marriage contracted any other way was no longer merely irregular. It was simply not a marriage at all. 4 centuries of tavern vows and orchard promises were, at a stroke, legally weightless, though the change took hold gradually, since the decree bound a parish only once it had been published there. The old rule lingered there in an increasingly untidy form, and by the early 18th century London had produced a small industry of hurried, quiet weddings, the so-called fleet marriages, performed in and around the debtors' prison of that name by clergymen whose scruples were negotiable, and in Protestant Europe the same thing happened by other routes and at different speeds through the marriage ordinances of cities and princes, which likewise required a public ceremony and a public record. England characteristically took rather longer, whose fees were modest. It was quick, it was private, and it was almost impossible to disprove afterwards, which was rather the point. It did not apply in Scotland, where the older and looser rules survived a great deal longer, which is precisely why, for the next century and more, a certain sort of English couple would find themselves in a carriage heading north at speed toward a village just over the border, called Gretna Green. From the following year, a valid marriage in England required banns or a licence, a ceremony in a parish church, and an entry in a register signed by the parties and by witnesses. Quakers and Jews were exempted. Everyone else was now, at last, on paper. And why that name still means what it means. And so the register book arrived, with its ruled columns and its dates and its careful clerical hand, and the whole vast, argumentative, gloriously human uncertainty was quietly filed away. We have inherited the register. We think of it as the natural order of things, that a marriage is a thing recorded, a document, a certificate folded in a drawer. For 400 years it was not. For 400 years it was two people, and what they said to each other, and whether anyone happened to be near enough to remember it. Which raises, of course, the other half of the question entirely. Because, if words alone could make a marriage, words alone could not run a household, or stock a farm, or keep anybody fed through a winter. And on that side of things the medieval world was not vague in the least. It was extremely precise, extremely detailed, and it kept excellent records. And so the law, having made marriage almost weightlessly easy, left everything heavy to be settled somewhere else. 2 willing voices, freely given, and the thing was done. That was the doctrine, and the church held to it. But no family with anything at all to lose ever behaved as though that were the whole story, and so the real energy of the business, the long patient grinding energy of it, went not into the vows, but into the property. If you want to find the place where medieval people actually concentrated, where they argued and calculated and lay awake in the dark, it is not the church porch, it is the account book. The word at the centre of all this is dowry, and it is worth slowing down over, because it has confused people for centuries, and it confuses them still. The dowry, sometimes called the marriage portion, was what the bride's family gave. It travelled with her. It went out of her father's household and into the new one, and in most of Europe, for most of the Middle Ages, it was understood as her share of the family's wealth. Handed over early, at the moment she left, instead of later, at the moment her parents died. She was, in a sense, being paid her inheritance in advance, and all in one piece, and then, quite often, being asked not to expect anything further. What that portion consisted of depended entirely on where a family sat. At the top it could be land, real land, named fields and a manor, and the rents that came with them, along with coin paid in instalments over years, because almost nobody had that much silver sitting in a chest. A little further down, among merchants and prosperous townspeople, it might be a sum of money, a shop's worth of stock, a house in a good street, or a share in a trading venture. Further down again, among ordinary village families, it becomes wonderfully concrete and rather touching. A cow. A bed, which meant not only a frame, but the mattress and the hangings and the coverlet, and which was often the single most valuable object a household owned. A brass pot, worth far more than he might expect, which turns up in wills again and again, quarrelled over by relatives. A pig. A few strips in the common field. Sometimes a set of tools, so that the couple began married life in possession of a trade as well as each other. And very often there was a chest. In much of Europe the bride arrived with a chest, and in some places, particularly in the Italian towns, that chest was itself a considerable object, painted along its front and lid and carried through the streets so that everybody could see it going by. Inside was linen. Sheets, napkins, shifts, tablecloths, all of it spun and woven and hemmed over years, sometimes begun when the girl was very small, laid down slowly the way other households laid down cider or salted meat. It smelled of the herbs packed between the folds. It represented an enormous quantity of unpaid work by the women of the household, quietly converted into something portable and valuable, and when it was carried into her new home it was the most visible sign that she had not arrived empty-handed. In some regions the whole business inflated alarmingly. In the Italian towns of the later Middle Ages, dowries climbed decade after decade, for the simple and very human reason that a family's standing was read directly off what it could settle on a daughter, and nobody wished to be the household that offered visibly less than its neighbours. A father with several daughters faced arithmetic that could genuinely ruin him. In Florence this eventually became a matter of public finance, and a civic fund was set up into which a man might pay small sums while his daughter was still a child, so that the money matured, with interest, at about the age she was likely to marry. A wedding portion, in other words, became something very like an investment product, complete with terms and conditions and disappointed expectations. Now, the confusing part. Alongside the dowry there was the dower, and the two words are so nearly identical that they have been muddling readers for centuries. They are not the same thing. They run in opposite directions. The dowry came from her family at the beginning and passed into the marriage. The dower came from his estate at the end and passed back to her, if she outlived him. The dower was the widow's provision, the promise that if he died first she would not be turned out onto the road with a bundle. One goes forward with her into the marriage. The other waits quietly behind, folded away in case she should ever need it. In England, the dower was commonly a share of the husband's lands, and the customary share was a third, held by the widow for her lifetime, after which it passed on to the heir as though she had only been keeping it warm. And in the English rite this was said out loud, at the church door, in front of everybody, as part of the words the man spoke to the woman. He endowed her with his worldly goods, and that endowment was not a poetic flourish. It was a legal act with witnesses. Sometimes a particular dower was named there and then. This manor, that mill, and the neighbours standing in the churchyard were the record of it. It is one of the loveliest overlaps in the whole subject that the most romantic sounding line in the ceremony was, in fact, the property settlement being read into the public memory of the parish. For anybody with property worth the trouble, none of this was left to the day itself. There was a contract, a real one, argued over in advance, sometimes for months. In the Mediterranean world it was drawn up by a notary, in a profession thick with them, and copied into registers that survive by the thousand. In the north it was written by a clerk and sealed, and among the great families it could run to a formidable length. It set out the portion and exactly when each instalment of it fell due. It set out the dower, and later in the Middle Ages a somewhat different arrangement called a jointure, in which lands were settled on the couple together, so that the widow's position was fixed in advance rather than argued over afterwards. It set out what the future children would inherit, and in what order, and what was to happen if there were no children at all. It set out what became of the portion if the bride died within a year or two, which was a real risk and was treated as one. It might even specify who would house the couple and for how long, and who would feed them while they got started, because a great many young couples began married life inside somebody else's household, and everybody preferred that to be written down. Getting to that contract was a slow and rather formal sport, and families were good at it. Almost nobody negotiated directly. There were go-betweens, an uncle, a godparent, a friendly neighbour with a reputation for discretion, a priest who knew both households, and in the larger towns there were people who did it more or less professionally and expected something for their trouble. Offers moved back and forth at a deliberate pace. A family weighed land against connections, and the two were not interchangeable. A modest portion from a family with powerful friends might be worth more than a generous one from a family with none. There was flattery, and there was stalling, and there were letters written in careful hands that said, in effect, we are very willing, but not at that figure. Letters survive from more than one merchant and gentry household, in which you can watch a marriage being assembled, the way a barn is assembled, piece by piece, with a great deal of standing about and looking at it. And when the thing was finally agreed, there was usually a token, a coin, a ring, a small gift handed over in front of witnesses, an earnest of the larger promise, so that the agreement had a physical shape and a moment attached to it, something people could later swear they had seen. Below all this, in the villages, there was a fee that tells you a great deal about how the world was arranged. On many manors an unfree tenant owed the lord a payment for permission to marry, and in England it was called merché. It was often charged when a daughter married, and it was frequently higher if she married away from the manor, out from under the lord's authority altogether. Similar dues existed elsewhere on the continent under other names. The sums were sometimes small, a few pence, sometimes a good deal more, scaled roughly to what the family could bear. What makes Mercier worth pausing over is not the money, it is what it reveals. A lord's wealth was not only his land. And there is something quietly astonishing about turning the pages of a manor court roll and finding a marriage recorded between a fine for letting a hedge fall into ruin and a payment for pasturing pigs in the Lord's wood in the same hand, in the same ink, as though all three were the same kind. It was the people on it, their labour, their children, their continuing presence. A daughter who married off the manor was, from the estate's point of view, an asset walking away. So the wedding got written into the accounts of event, which, administratively, they were. That system did not last. After the great mortality of the 14th century, when there were suddenly far fewer hands than there was work, the leverage shifted. Labour became scarce and therefore precious. Tenants could go elsewhere and find somebody glad to have them, and dues of this kind eroded, quietly, unevenly, over generations. Nobody abolished them in a single dramatic stroke. They simply became harder to collect, and then awkward to demand, and then a memory. In the towns the arithmetic was different but no less binding. An apprentice was generally forbidden to marry during his term, and that prohibition was not moral fussiness. It was household logistics. He lived in the master's house, ate at the master's table, slept under the master's roof, and was in every practical sense a member of that family for the length of his indenture. A wife had no place in that arrangement, and neither did the children who might follow. So marriage waited until the term ran out, and since terms were long, 7 years being common, this is one of the reasons ordinary town men in northwestern Europe married comparatively late, in their 20s, once they had a trade and some prospect of a roof. Which brings us to one of the great unromantic engines of the medieval economy, which is that a very large number of businesses changed hands through marriage. When a master craftsman died, his widow frequently kept the workshop going. The rules varied from craft to craft and town to town, and were often grudging, sometimes limiting how long she might continue, or whether she could keep apprentices. But the practice was widespread and in many places entirely normal. She had the premises, the tools, the stock, the customers, and the name over the door. And a journeyman, a fully trained man with skill and no capital, had precisely none of those things and no realistic prospect of buying them. You can see the arrangement forming from here. He married the widow, or he married the master's daughter, and in a single afternoon he acquired a workshop it might otherwise have taken him 20 years to assemble. Put plainly, and medieval people were entirely capable of putting it plainly, the fastest way to own a bakery was to marry a bakery. It sounds cold, written down like that. In practice, these were people who had worked side by side in the same building for years, who knew each other's tempers and habits, and there is no particular reason to assume that liking played no part in it. But the property moved, and it moved along the same channel as the affection, and everyone involved could see both. And then, at the top, the same logic simply grew larger until it turned into foreign policy. Ruling families married for alliance, and a marriage was frequently a clause inside a peace treaty, one term among many, sitting alongside the surrender of a fortress and the release of prisoners. Dowries at that level were not chests of linen. They were towns, castles, jurisdictions, revenues, and cash installments that treasuries genuinely could not pay, and often did not, which is why an unpaid dowry could become a durable grievance and occasionally a stated reason for the next quarrel. Envoys were sent to look at a prospective bride and to report back, tactfully, on her health and her bearing and her likely disposition. Portraits travelled. Embassies moved slowly across Europe carrying offers, and the whole apparatus could take years to arrive at a wedding that redrew a boundary. And because these houses had been intermarrying for generations, they were all cousins, which meant the church's own rules of kinship were constantly in the way, and dispensations were sought as a matter of routine. Children were betrothed into this machinery, and it should be said plainly and without drama. Canon law set the ages at which a marriage could be made at 12 for a girl and 14 for a boy, and agreements made below those ages were promises rather than marriages, and could be repudiated when the child reached the age of consent. Even where a betrothal held, the two very often did not live together for years afterwards, remaining in their own households or being fostered in another for their education. This was an elite practice, driven by land and alliance. It was not how ordinary Europe married. Ordinary people in the north and west married considerably later, in their 20s, after years of service and saving, and that is the pattern that describes almost everybody. Spare a thought, though, for the individual at the centre of a treaty. Usually, a young woman, sent hundreds of miles to a place she had never seen, learning a new language on the road, arriving with a household of her own attendants, who were themselves a small piece of diplomacy, and expected to be the living guarantee of a peace made by men she might never meet again. Some were unhappy, some were homesick for decades, and a striking number became formidable in their new countries, running estates, holding regencies, intervening in politics with considerable skill, precisely because everybody had underestimated the peace being moved. Which leaves the honest tension in all of this, and it is worth naming rather than smoothing over. This was a system that treated marriage first and foremost as property law. The paperwork does not blush. It talks about portions and reversions and heirs of the body, and it makes no promises whatsoever about anybody being happy. And yet real people lived inside it, and built lives there, and left traces of themselves behind. You find them in wills, which is where medieval affection tends to surface, because a will is the place where a man could exceed what the law required of him. Again and again, a testator leaves his wife more than her dower entitled her to, names her as his executor, which is to say, trusts her with the whole tangle of his affairs, and calls her beloved while doing it. That word is not in the contract. Nothing obliged him to write it. He wrote it anyway. So the money was settled, the portion agreed, the dower named at the door, and remembered by the parish. All of which left one further question, and it was the one the church cared about most, and the one most likely to bring the whole careful edifice quietly down. Whether these two particular people were permitted to marry each other at all. So the contracts were drawn, and the livestock were counted, and the two families had settled, more or less amicably, on who would hand over what. But underneath all that patient arithmetic there sat another question, and it was a far stranger one. Before anybody could argue about a dowry, before the linen was folded into the chest and the cow was led out of the byre, somebody had to be reasonably confident that these two particular people were permitted to marry each other at all. And on that subject, the medieval church had a great deal to say. It had drawn its rules as a series of careful circles of forbidden closeness around every living person, and for a long stretch of the Middle Ages, those circles were extraordinarily wide. The principle itself was not unusual. Almost every society that has ever existed has said that some relatives are too close to marry, and has been very firm about where the line falls. What made the medieval church remarkable was how far out it pushed that line, and how long it kept it there. For several centuries the prohibition reached to what canon lawyers called the seventh degree of kinship, counted in the manner the church preferred, which meant counting generations back to whatever ancestor two people shared. In that reckoning, brother and sister stood at the first degree, first cousins at the second, second cousins at the third, and so on outward, one step for each generation you had to climb before the family tree joined. The seventh degree, then, took in sixth cousins. It took in everybody descended from a single couple who had lived 7 generations earlier, which is to say, a pair of great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, nobody in the parish could possibly name, whose bones lay somewhere under the churchyard grass without a marker. Consider what that meant as arithmetic. Go back 7 generations, and any person has, on paper, more than 100 ancestors standing at that level. Every one of those 100-odd people had brothers and sisters, and every one of those brothers and sisters had children and children's children, spreading outward through the villages of a district like water finding its way across a field. The number of people a single villager was theoretically forbidden to marry ran, on that reckoning, into the hundreds and quite possibly the thousands. And most people did not travel far to find a spouse. They married someone born within a few miles of them, met at a market or a harvest or a saint's day, whose family their own family had known for as long as anybody could remember, which produced a situation of considerable comedy, if you were not the one living in it. Take a village of 200 souls sitting in its own fields, with a mill at one end and a small stone church at the other, the same handful of surnames turning up in the same rent rolls for generations. Nearly everybody in that village was related to nearly everybody else, if you went back far enough, and the church was asking them to go back very far indeed. Strictly applied, the rule would have made the ordinary marriage of ordinary people close to impossible. Villagers would have had to marry outward, wholesale, in every generation, which is not what the records suggest they did. Some historians have suggested that this was rather the point, that pushing families to look outward loosened the grip of the great kin groups. Others think the rule simply grew by its own logic, one council building on the last, until nobody could quite remember why the circle had become so wide. Either way, it was no help at all to a young man wondering whether the girl at the mill was a cousin. So how did people manage? Largely, and rather beautifully, by not knowing. Memory was the only genealogical record most families had, and memory in a world without paper is short and pragmatic. People could usually name their grandparents. They could sometimes name a great-grandparent if that person had been notable or long-lived, or had left behind a piece of land that was still being argued about. When the banns were read out on 3 Sundays, in a church that smelled of cold stone and candle smoke with the spring light coming in sideways across the flagstones, and the priest asked whether anyone present knew of an impediment, the question was genuinely being put to the communities. Beyond that, the past dissolved into a comfortable fog, and a fog is a wonderful thing to be married in. And the community's collective memory would furrow its brow, think about it, shift its feet, and generally decide that it did not. There were always 1 or 2 old women in any parish who knew precisely whose grandmother had been whose aunt, and who could be relied upon to say so in a carrying voice. But even they had their limits, and the limits fell a long way short of the 7th degree. When a case did reach a church court, and cases did, usually because somebody wanted a marriage undone rather than because a conscience had begun to trouble anybody, the proceedings had a homely quality that sits oddly with the gravity of the question. The court would send for the oldest people it could find. Men of 70 and 80 would be brought in to say what they remembered of who had been whose, and they would count it out slowly on their fingers, and they would contradict one another. One would put a great-aunt on the wrong side of the family. Another would recall a wedding from a harvest when it had rained for 3 days. A clerk wrote it all down in careful Latin, and out of that soft, disagreeing material the court then had to build a line of descent solid enough to stand a judgment on. And then, as if blood relations were not complicated enough, there was spiritual kinship. This is the part that tends to surprise people most, because it has no modern equivalent. In medieval theology, baptism did not merely wash a child clean, it created a real relationship, a bond as genuine as the one made by birth. The godparents who stood at the font and answered for the infant became, in the eyes of canon law, that child's parents in the spirit, which meant the child could not later marry them. And it went further still, into a relationship the lawyers called co-parenthood, which linked the godparents to the child's own mother and father, and their families to one another, so that two households with no drop of shared blood between them could find themselves permanently unable to. It also meant the child could not marry their children, because those were, in this reckoning, brothers and sisters. Intermarry, because one of them had once carried the other's baby to the church. Godparenthood was no small ceremonial nicety. It was one of the main ways ordinary families built alliances, obligations, and safety nets. A well-chosen godparent might feed your child in a bad winter, speak for him in a manor court, or take him in if you died. Families collected these bonds deliberately, and children commonly had more than one set of them. Every one of those useful, affectionate, practical connections quietly closed a door on the marriage market a decade or two later. It is easy to imagine a mother doing the sums at a christening, holding a very small person in a long white cloth, calculating with one half of her mind who this would help, and with the other whom it would rule out. There was a third circle as well, and it arrived through marriage itself. If a young woman was widowed in her first year, as happened often enough, she remained legally kin to her late husband's whole family, and could not simply marry his brother, however sensible that might have looked to everyone concerned, however neatly it would have kept the land and the children. It was called affinity, and it held that when two people married, each became related to the other's family, not metaphorically but in law. Your wife's sister became your sister, your husband's brother became your brother. And this did not end when the marriage ended, and the household together. Widows and widowers therefore had to look outside a circle that had just been enlarged by the very marriage they had lost. By the early 13th century, the unworkability of all this was obvious to the people running the system. And so, at the Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215, one of the great gatherings of the medieval church, the prohibition was pulled back from the 7th degree to the 4th. In practice, this meant that from then on the barrier stopped at third cousins. Sixth cousins, fifth cousins, fourth cousins were all released, at a stroke, into the ordinary world of people one might reasonably marry. The council said, in effect, that the old rule had become impossible to observe, and the men who wrote that were not being cynical but realistic. It is not often that one can point to a single medieval decision and call it a straightforward mercy to ordinary people, but this was one. All across Europe, in villages whose names never reached a chronicle, the arithmetic of whom a young man might court quietly became a great deal simpler, and nobody in those villages ever knew the name of the council that had done it for them. For those who did fall inside the forbidden circle and wanted to marry anyway, there was a remedy, and it was an entirely official one. The church could dispense with its own rule. A dispensation was a formal permission, granted after a petition explaining the relationship and the reasons for it, and administered like any other piece of business, with clerks, registers, and fees. The wealthy used it constantly. Aristocratic families married one another over and over across a small pool of suitable houses, and after a few generations almost any two great families were related within the degrees somehow. So the petitions went off, the permissions came back, and the marriage went ahead. None of this was scandalous or hidden. It was paperwork. It was much like applying for a license today, if licenses took the better part of a year and travelled by mule over the Alps. What is worth noticing is that it cost money, and money was not equally distributed, so the rule pressed rather harder on a ploughman in Kent than on a count in Champagne. There is a consequence of all this that deserves stating plainly and then leaving alone. A marriage that fell inside the forbidden degrees was not merely irregular, it was invalid from the very beginning. It had never legally existed. And that gave a powerful person weary of a marriage a possible route out. If a kinship could be discovered and demonstrated, a court could declare that there had been no marriage at all. Sometimes the kinship really had been unknown. Sometimes, it must be said, it had been perfectly well known to everybody for years and had troubled nobody until the moment it became useful. This was a recognized pattern in the great families of medieval Europe, and it is said that one or two famous royal separations were arranged along exactly those lines, with genealogies produced by lawyers who had not been especially curious about them before. The Church's courts were not, on the whole, willing accomplices. They turned down a good many such petitions, and the process was long, expensive, and thoroughly public. But the door existed, and the people with the resources to walk through it were the people who had wanted a door. Underneath every one of these rules sat a principle that is easy to overlook and genuinely radical for its time, that a marriage was made by the free consent of the two people marrying, and by nothing else. Not by the parents, not by the Lord, not by the money. Church lawyers were unusually clear about this, and they meant it in a way that had teeth. Marriages made under real force or real fear could be, and sometimes were, set aside on exactly that ground. There are cases in the surviving court records of young men and women coming forward to say that they had been frightened into consenting and being listened to. And yet, it would be a kindness to nobody to pretend that this made medieval marriage a matter of free personal choice, as we would understand it. Coercion by threat was forbidden, persuasion was not. A family that had been negotiating for months, that had fattened a pig for the feast, that had told the neighbours and settled the land and thought about nothing else all winter, did not generally need to threaten anybody. The pressure of a whole village leaning gently in one direction is a formidable thing, and it leaves no mark that a court can see. It is worth remembering, too, that most people in northwestern Europe came to all this as adults, commonly marrying in their 20s after years of working and saving in other households. The very young betrothals one hears of belonged to great estates where land and alliance were being arranged. So the law protected a real freedom, and the world around the law spent most of its energy making sure that the freedom was exercised in the expected direction, and both of those things were true at once. Between families, and even there the two households usually lived apart for years afterwards. Which brings us, at the end of all this counting of cousins, to the widows. Remarriage was extremely common in the Middle Ages, far more common than it would later become, because marriages ended by death often and early. A widow with a holding, a workshop, or a going trade was one of the most independent women in her society, and also one of the most sought after, and many remarried within a year or two. The law was on her side rather more than one might expect. The English Magna Carta, of all documents, contains a clause protecting a widow from being compelled to marry against her will, which tells you both that the protection existed and that somebody had felt the need to write it down. If a couple's match struck the neighbourhood as unsuitable, and a wide gap in age was the classic offence, then the young men of the parish would gather outside the house after dark with pots, pans, kettles, cowbells, tongs, horns, and anything else that could be persuaded to make a noise it was. The village, however, had its own opinions, and expressed them in the least dignified way imaginable, never designed to make. This was the charivari, known in England as rough music, a serenade of pure clatter kept up under the shutters until the household could bear it no longer. It was not, in most places, a threatening business, more a piece of organised heckling with a point buried somewhere inside it. And it had a recognised ending, which is the most medieval detail of all. The couple would come to the door and pay the noisemakers off, with coins or more often with drink, and everybody would go away contented, having established that the neighbours had noticed and that the neighbours had been squared. One imagines the household afterwards, gone suddenly quiet, listening to the last kettle being banged somewhere down the lane, and deciding that on the whole it had been worth it. All of which is to say that the rules about who might marry whom were vast, tangled, unevenly applied, and navigated daily by people who had only the haziest idea of their finer points. What they were not, in the end, was the thing that decided a marriage. The lawyers drew their circles and the councils redrew them, the clerks copied out their dispensations, the neighbours banged their kettles in the lane. And inside all of that, two ordinary people still had to live together in the same few rooms for 30 or 40 years, and that is where the real history of a medieval marriage is kept. After all of that, the forbidden degrees, the cousins counted on the fingers of a patient clerk, the whole careful architecture of who might stand beside whom at a church door. There is a question that has been waiting quietly at the back of the room. With so much machinery involved, the contracts and the dowries, the banns read 3 Sundays running, the courts untangling who had promised what to whom in which orchard, was there any love in it at all? The honest answer is yes. Rather more of it, in fact, than the paperwork would lead you to expect. It simply arrived in a different order than we are used to. The best-known English example is the correspondence of the Paston family of Norfolk, a gentry family who spent the 15th century acquiring property, defending property, and writing to one another about property, and who kept a great heap of their letters as evidence for disputes that never. We know this partly because ordinary people wrote letters, and a few of those letters survived, mostly by accident, mostly because somebody was involved in a lawsuit and kept everything. Quite ended. But the letters are also, quite unavoidably, domestic. A wife writes to a husband away in London, and after the matter of the manor and the money and the man who must be spoken to, she tells him the children are well, and asks him to buy her a length of cloth, and reminds him to look after his health, and says the house is very quiet. He writes back about the case and about the cloth. This is not the language of high romance. It is the language of two people running a complicated enterprise together and rather liking each other while they do it, which is what most affection sounds like from the outside. There is one letter in that bundle people are especially fond of, written by a young woman named Marjorie Bruce in the winter of 1477 to John Paston, whom she wished to marry, at a moment when the two families were still arguing about money. She calls him her well-beloved Valentine, and it is often described as the oldest surviving Valentine letter in English, which may or may not be strictly true, but is a pleasant thing to believe on a February evening. What is striking about it is not the endearment. It is that she was writing to say, in effect, that her father would not go any higher on the dowry, and that she wished John would take her anyway. Money and tenderness in the same breath, in the same handwriting. That is the medieval marriage in miniature. And the same family gives us the other side of it. One of the Paston daughters, also called Marjorie, exchanged words of marriage with Richard Calais, the family's bailiff, a capable man trusted with the accounts and entirely unsuitable in the family's eyes. The Pastons were appalled. They separated the two. They applied every kind of pressure a 15th century family could apply, and it made no difference, because of the law we spent an earlier part of this evening admiring. The Bishop of Norwich examined the couple separately, asked each of them what words they had said, and concluded that the words had done their work. The family's own steward had married the family's daughter, and no amount of horror could unsay it. She was, from what we can tell, more or less shut out of the household. He went on keeping their accounts because good bailiffs were hard to find, which is a very human detail. They could not forgive him as a son-in-law, and could not manage without him as an employee. In the Tuscan town of Prato, there survives one of the most extraordinary private archives in Europe, the papers of a merchant named Francesco d'Attini, who died at the very beginning of the 15th century and left his fortune to a charity for the poor of the town, with the happy result that his. England is not the only place this happens. House, and everything in it, was left alone. Tens of thousands of documents came down to us, and threaded through the ledgers and the notes about wool and dye are letters between Francesco and his wife Margherita. He was away a great deal. She ran the household and wrote to him about it, and her letters are wonderfully unsentimental. Instructions, complaints, reports on the servants and the stores, occasional sharpness about his working too much and coming home too little. And still, across all those years and all that distance, two people kept writing because there was somebody at the other end worth writing to. It helps to remember that a medieval marriage was not only a private bond. It was a small working business, and both halves of it worked, and shared work over many years is one of the oldest ways people have of becoming fond of one another. The dead offer their own quiet evidence. Walk through an old parish church in England or northern France, and you will find, in a side chapel, a stone knight and his lady lying on a tomb chest, side by side, feet resting on a lion or a small patient dog, hands folded upward in prayer. And now and then, not often, but often enough to notice, the hands are not folded in prayer at all. They are holding each other. Somebody commissioned that. Somebody said to a mason, "When you carve us like this." Not every pair of joined hands is untouched. The most famous of them, an earl and his countess in Chichester Cathedral, has been much restored, and some accounts suggest the linked hands owe a good deal to 19th century sympathies. But the gesture appears in genuinely medieval work too, and even where a later hand tidied it, the tidying tells you the idea felt right. When people imagined a married couple lying in stone for 600 years, they imagined them holding on. The small things say it as well as the great ones. Rings from the later Middle Ages sometimes carry a short motto engraved inside the band, where nobody but the wearer would ever see it. Some were made in interlocking hoops that came apart and fitted together again, so that each person could keep a piece until the day the pieces were joined. Here is the difference, though, and it is subtle, and it changes everything. We tend to think of love as the reason for marriage, the precondition, the thing whose absence makes the whole arrangement a sort of fraud. The medieval expectation ran the other way. You married suitably. You married a person your family and your community and your priest could all agree was appropriate, whose land lay conveniently near yours, whose relatives you could bear at a feast. And then, having married suitably, you set about growing fond. Affection was not the entrance requirement. It was the hoped-for harvest. The canon lawyers even had a phrase for the thing itself, inherited from Roman law, marital affection, it did not mean the flutter of feeling. It meant a settled disposition to treat this person as your spouse, to keep house with them, to acknowledge them publicly, to intend the whole business as permanent. It was a legal concept, and yet it points at something true. Affection, in that world, was a practice before it was a feeling, made out of 1,000 ordinary acts, sharing the fire, minding each other's health, keeping the accounts straight, getting through the winter. And because the expectation was modest, it was frequently exceeded. Nobody had been promised a soulmate. What they had been told was that they were now bound to a particular person, in a particular house, for good, and that they had better make something workable of it. A surprising number of them did. The wills are quietly eloquent here. Men and women leaving each other far more than the law required, adding personal bequests to the legal ones, asking to be buried beside a spouse who had gone first, sometimes decades earlier, in the same corner of the same churchyard. Sometimes we get to hear a real marriage in a real voice. Marjorie Kempe of Bishop's Lynn in Norfolk dictated an account of her life in the early 15th century, and her husband John moves through it as a thoroughly recognizable man. She had a great many children and a great many visions, and she wished to live a life of intense religious devotion, which required a formal agreement between the two of them, made before a bishop. The memorable scene is not the bishop. It is the negotiation, conducted on a hot road in midsummer while they were travelling, with cake and drink to hand. He would agree to her vow, he said, on certain conditions, that she settle his debts before she went off on her pilgrimages, and that she stop fasting on Fridays and eat and drink with him as a wife should. It is one of the least mystical passages in a deeply mystical book, a marriage renegotiated by two tired people at the side of a road, each holding out for what mattered most. Years later, when he was old and had a bad fall at home, it was Marjorie who came back and nursed him, and she's quite frank about finding it hard work. Whatever that marriage was, and it was clearly not simple, it held. Meanwhile, the audiences of Europe were devouring stories about a completely different kind of love, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Iseult, knights riding through forests in a state of exquisite anguish over women they could not sensibly have. Romance literature was enormously popular, and it is not hard to see why. It was the opposite of the parish register. It offered overwhelming, inconvenient, socially catastrophic passion to a world in which marriages were arranged between neighbouring fields. There is even a 12th century treatise on love, much argued over by scholars, which states with a straight face that true love cannot exist between husband and wife, since what is freely given cannot also be owed as a duty. Nobody is entirely sure how seriously its author meant it. But the fact that anyone could write the sentence tells you that people already felt the gap between the marriage they lived in and the love they read about. The Church, for its part, had a good deal to say on the subject, and much of it was warmer than we assume. Preachers told husbands to love their wives and to be patient with them. There was a much-repeated sermon image, worn smooth by centuries of use, that Eve was made from Adam's side, not from his head, so that she should not rule over him, and not from his foot, so that he should not trample her, but from his side, close under his arm, to be his companion. Canon law also held, with real consistency, that the obligations of marriage were mutual, and that neither spouse could simply walk away. In a world organized almost entirely by hierarchy, that small pocket of symmetry is genuinely remarkable. Which brings us, gently, to a question that tends to surprise people. If all of this was medieval, the door, the vows, the ring, the feast, the law, how much of a wedding today actually comes down to us from it? Almost none of it. That is the truth of it. and there is something wonderfully deflating about it. The white dress is Victorian. Queen Victoria married Albert in 1840 in white silk trimmed with English lace. Partly, it is said, to support the lace makers, and the ladies' magazines described the gown in loving detail to a readership that had never before been able to picture a royal bride so soon after the wedding. Before that, brides wore their best dress, whatever colour it happened to be, blue, russet, grey, a good green, because it had to go on being their best dress afterwards. The idea that white signifies purity was attached later, tidily, by people who had already decided they liked white. The towering iced cake with its pillars and tiers is Victorian too, made possible by cheap refined sugar and confectioners with something to prove. The honeymoon began as the bridal tour, a 19th century fashion for the couple to visit relatives who had not been able to attend, gradually shedding the relatives until only the holiday remained. The diamond engagement ring is more recent still. Diamonds were quite unfashionable for such a purpose, until an advertising campaign in the middle of the 20th century persuaded the world that a stone was the proper measure of an intention. The bridal party in matching dresses, the photographer, the seating plan, the speeches in their particular order, Victorian, Edwardian, or later. Even the music that brides walk in and out to comes from two 19th century composers, popularized, it is often said, by a royal wedding in the 1850s. A medieval bride would not have recognized any of it. She would not entirely have recognized the setting either. The porch gave way in time to the inside of the church, and the private exchange of words that had been enough for so long was steadily hedged about with requirements: a priest, witnesses, a register, and eventually a state that wanted it written down. That tidying up took centuries, and it is the reason a modern wedding feels so much more organized than the one we have been standing at all evening. But there are things she would recognize, and they have lasted longest precisely because nobody designed them. She would recognize the ring, and which finger it went on, because the fourth finger of the left hand was already the ring finger, on the strength of an old and entirely mistaken belief that a vein ran directly from it to the heart. She would recognize the flowers in a bride's hair, and the bands, and that strange, faintly alarming moment when the priest asks whether anyone knows any reason why these two may not be joined. A moment which survives today as pure theatre, and which was once a genuine invitation to a genuine. She would recognize the vows, spoken in the ordinary language of the country rather than in Latin, because the point was that everybody present should understand exactly what was being said. Legal objection, with a genuine chance that somebody's aunt would take it up. She would recognize the feast, and the noise of it, and the neighbours eating far too much. And she would recognize, most of all, that the whole village turned out, because a marriage was never only the couple's business. So let us go back, one last time, to the two people we left standing in the porch at the beginning of the evening. The spring light is coming in low across the churchyard. The priest has heard the words, and joined the hands, and blessed the ring, and it has gone on to the finger with the vein that does not exist. The Mass is over. The heavy door swings back, and the two of them come out into the noise, the pipes and the drum, somebody's dog, somebody's child underfoot, a shower of grain or dried flowers, the smell of roast meat drifting from a house where the fire has been going since before dawn. Their names have been said aloud in front of everyone they will ever know. Whatever happens now, the good harvests and the bad, the children, the winters, the long stretches of nothing much at all, happens to the two of them together, and the village has agreed to remember that it does. They did not invent any of this. They inherited it, adjusted it slightly, and handed it on, and it came down through the centuries a little battered and much redecorated until it reached us. Somewhere tonight, a ring is sitting on a finger chosen for a vein that was never there, and none of it is really about the cake. The candles are burning low now in the hall of a house that stopped existing 600 years ago. The music has gone soft. Outside, the fields are dark and the road is empty and the day is over at last. Sleep well,